Rose Dalton pressed her last $1.17 into her palm so hard the coins left marks on her skin. She didn't look up when the laughter started. She didn't look up when Beatrice Langford's voice cut through that store like a blade through old cloth. Loud, deliberate, designed to wound. She only reached for her sister's hand, and Mabel's fingers were already shaking. If you've ever stood somewhere you had every right to be and still felt like the walls were closing in, you already know exactly how this story begins. Before we go any further, if this story already has your heart, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop the name of your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Every comment means the world to me. Now let's go back to Willow Creek, Wyoming, the summer of 1882. And the morning two sisters walked into a store they almost didn't walk back out of. Rose had repaired the hem on her brown dress 3 times that week. The thread she'd used was mismatched, a shade lighter than the fabric, because matching thread cost 2 cents more, and 2 cents was 2 cents. She knew exactly what she looked like standing there on the wooden sidewalk outside Whitmore Dry Goods that Tuesday morning. She knew because she had looked at herself in the small cracked mirror above the washstand before they left home, and she had told herself the same thing. She told herself every morning when the reflection wasn't what she wished it was. You are clean. You are decent. You have done nothing wrong. She believed it. She had to believe it. Because if she stopped believing it, she didn't know how she would keep walking. "Ready?" she said. Mabel stood beside her, smoothing the front of her faded blue dress with both hands the way she always did when she was nervous. Small, careful strokes, like she was trying to press the worry out through the fabric. The dress had 7 visible patches, and at least 4 that were hidden beneath the outer layer. Small reinforcements Rose had added before Mabel could see them and feel ashamed. "I'm ready," Mabel said. She didn't sound ready, but she never turned back, and Rose loved her for that. They pushed through the door together. The bell above it rang twice, sharp and bright, the way it rang for everyone. For exactly 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the conversations changed. Rose felt it before she fully understood it. That particular shift in the air of a room when eyes move and mouths curve, and people who know each other exchange looks that don't require words. She had felt it before. In church, when their father's coffin had been the plainest one at the front. In the post office, when she had asked to send a letter and had to count out the coins twice because her hands were unsteady. She recognized the feeling the way you recognize rain before a single drop falls, by the pressure of what's coming. She kept her chin level. She steered Mabel toward the far counter where the thread was kept. The store smelled of raw wood and dried herbs and the faint sweetness of molasses from an open barrel near the back wall. Light came through 2 front windows in long, pale columns. There were perhaps 11 or 12 people inside. Women examining fabric bolts, a man waiting at the hardware counter, 2 older women near the ribbons, and Beatrice Langford, standing at the center of the floor like she'd been placed there specifically to take up space. Rose had seen Beatrice before. Everyone in Willow Creek had seen Beatrice before. She was the kind of woman who entered a room and immediately reorganized its social geography, simply by deciding where she stood. Her dress was pale yellow, impossibly clean, trimmed at the collar with ivory lace. Her hair was arranged with the kind of casual perfection that actually required 40 minutes of a hired girl's work every morning. She was 26 years old and had never once in her life stood at a counter counting coins. She looked at Mabel. Her gaze went straight to the patches, and then she smiled. "Good heavens," Beatrice said. She said it at full volume, not to any particular friend, to the room. "Are those patches holding the dress together, or is the dress holding the patches together?" The laughter came fast, the way laughter always does when someone important decides what's funny. 3 women near the fabric bolts, 1 near the ribbons. A sound from somewhere behind the hardware counter that might have been a laugh disguised as a cough. Rose's hand tightened on her purse. Mabel stopped moving. Rose watched her sister's shoulders do the thing they did when Mabel was trying to make herself smaller. A slow, barely visible descent, like a flower closing before a storm. It broke something in Rose every single time she saw it, and she had seen it more times than she could count. "Don't," Rose said quietly, and she wasn't speaking to Beatrice. She was speaking to Mabel. "Don't close. Don't disappear. Stay here with me." Mabel's fingers found Rose's sleeve. Rose walked them both forward. She reached the thread counter. She asked the shopkeeper, a thin, nervous man named Aldous Webb, who had worked at Whitmore's for 20 years and had developed the particular talent of seeing nothing he didn't wish to see, for 2 spools of brown thread, heavyweight. He reached for them. Beatrice wasn't finished. She had drifted toward the fabric display, the way a hawk drifts, with a kind of deliberate ease that doesn't fool anyone. She lifted a bolt of deep blue wool from the display table, unrolled a length of it, and held it against her own shoulder. She turned toward the small mirror mounted on the display post. Then she let her gaze slide sideways, toward Mabel, in the way that made certain it was noticed by everyone watching. "Some fabrics," she said, adjusting the cloth against her collar, "simply aren't made for certain women." She wasn't asking anyone to agree. She was announcing it. The way you announce weather. The way you announce something that requires no argument because you've decided it is simply true. The women near the ribbon display smiled. One of them pressed her fingers against her mouth. Another looked deliberately away, which was its own kind of agreement. Aldous Webb set the thread on the counter without looking at anyone. Mabel reached into her purse. Then she stopped. Rose watched her sister's hand go still inside the small cloth bag. She watched the expression on Mabel's face change. Not into anger, not into tears, but into something quieter than either of those. A kind of closing down. A retreat into somewhere interior, somewhere protected, where other people's cruelty couldn't quite reach. "Rose," Mabel said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Let's go." "We need the thread," Rose said. "I know, but let's just—" Mabel's voice cracked very slightly, and she pressed it back. "Let's just go." Rose stood absolutely still for 2 full seconds. She was 33 cents short of what she'd planned to spend. She had been planning to ask if she could have a small amount of credit on account, which she had done once before when things were desperate, and which had cost her more dignity than she liked to remember. She had been rehearsing the words on the walk into town. She had arranged them into something that sounded matter-of-fact, something that wouldn't give Beatrice Langford or anyone like her any additional ammunition. She put the thread back on the counter. She took Mabel's arm, and they turned toward the door. It opened before they reached it. The bell rang again. Once this time, a single clean sound, and a man stepped through and into the space between them and the street. How was tall? Not the theatrical tall of a man who knew he was being observed, but the functional tall of someone who had spent years working in wide-open spaces and had simply grown into the dimensions required by that kind of life. His shoulders were broad beneath a light work shirt with the sleeves rolled to just below the elbow. His hands, hanging loose at his sides, were the hands of a man who had repaired fences, pulled calves, driven cattle through mountain passes in October wind. They were weathered and capable and entirely unself-conscious. He wore a brown hat, dark with use at the brim, and his boots were the boots of someone who had been working since early morning. He stopped just inside the door. He looked at the room, and he looked at them, at Rose and Mabel, who had been in the act of leaving. Something moved across his face that Rose couldn't immediately name. It wasn't pity. She was very familiar with what pity looked like, the particular soft condescension of people who felt sorry for you while remaining entirely comfortable in their own distance from your situation. This wasn't that. It was something more like recognition. Like he understood exactly what had just happened in this room and exactly what it cost. He removed his hat. The gesture was deliberate, not a quick social reflex but a considered movement, an old courtesy extended carefully. He did not look at Beatrice. He walked toward Mabel. Not toward Rose first, not toward the counter, not toward the general space of the room. Directly toward Mabel, who had lowered her head again in that way that always made Rose want to step between her sister and the whole world. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her dress, not the way Beatrice had looked at it. Not cataloging patches or judging worn fabric or calculating the distance between Mabel's clothes and the clothes of a woman worth noticing. He looked at it the way a man looks at work, carefully, with the eyes of someone who knows what effort costs. His gaze moved to a patch near the shoulder seam. A complicated piece of work that Rose knew had taken Mabel the better part of an evening, fitting a curved piece of mismatched fabric into a stressed seam without letting the repair show on the outside if you didn't look closely. "You repaired that yourself?" he asked. His voice was low and direct. No performance in it. Mabel looked up, which she almost never did when strangers spoke to her. "Yes," she said. He continued looking at the stitching. "That's better work than the tailor in Cheyenne put on my best coat," he said. He said it the way you say something when you mean it, without decoration, without the additional warmth that turns a compliment into theater. A fact, stated plainly. The way a man who works with real things all day long states facts about real things. The room was completely silent. Not the silence of people being polite. The silence of people who have just understood something they weren't expecting to understand. Rose looked at Beatrice. Beatrice's expression had gone still in a very particular way. Not embarrassed, not immediately, but recalibrating. Measuring the situation. Trying to understand who this man was and what his presence now meant for the calculation she had made when she opened her mouth. Then one of her companions leaned toward another and said something in a low voice. Rose caught two words. Mercer Ridge. She didn't know what that meant yet, but the way the room shifted again when those words moved through it, the way Aldous Webb's spine straightened at his counter, the way the woman near the ribbons stopped smiling, told her that it meant something considerable. The man turned toward the shopkeeper. "How much fabric do you have?" he asked. Webb blinked. "What kind?" The man looked at Beatrice. Not aggressively. Not with the particular heat of someone wanting a confrontation. With something much quieter than that. A kind of level attention that was somehow more powerful than anger, precisely because it contained no anger at all. "The kind these ladies were told wasn't meant for them," he said. Aldous Webb looked at the bolt of deep blue wool that Beatrice was still holding against herself. He looked at the man. He reached for it. Beatrice released the fabric slowly. She didn't argue. She was still recalibrating. The man, whose name Rose did not yet know, purchased fabric. More than made any immediate sense. Several bolts, different weights and colors, more than any one household required on a single visit. Webb wrapped them without asking questions. Then the man turned back. He pulled a piece of paper from his vest pocket. He held it out to Rose, not to Mabel, which Rose noted he had understood without asking which of them handled the practical decisions. "My name is Caleb Mercer," he said. "I own Mercer Ridge Ranch, about 6 miles north of town. The address is there." Rose took the paper. She looked at it without unfolding it. "Mercer Ridge needs work," he continued. "Curtains, bedding, table linens, work shirts for my hands, repairs on quite a few things that have been neglected. It's not a small job." Rose said nothing. "I'm not offering charity," he said. He looked at her steadily, and she understood immediately that he meant it, that he had chosen his words specifically to address the thing she would have rejected. "I'm offering work. There's a difference." "There is," Rose said. She hadn't decided anything yet. She wasn't the kind of woman who decided anything quickly when the decision involved trusting a man she didn't know. Caleb Mercer nodded once. Then he turned back to Mabel. The way he looked at her this time was the same as before. Not different because she was the younger sister. Not different because she was quieter. Not adjusted for the assumptions that other people had been making about Mabel Dalton her entire life. Equal. Direct. As if what she thought was as worth addressing as what anyone else thought. "I pay well for talent," he said. The word talent landed in the room like something physical. Not charity. Not kindness. Not generosity toward women who couldn't afford better. Talent. As if what Mabel possessed was a professional asset with a market value, because it was, because it had always been, because the only thing that had ever prevented the world from recognizing it was the world's persistent habit of deciding what kind of women were worth seeing. Mabel didn't answer immediately, but she raised her head, and she kept it raised. Rose watched her sister's posture change, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone who didn't know her would necessarily notice, but in the way that Rose had been watching for her entire life. The shoulders that had been folding inward stopped folding. A very small thing. The most important thing Rose had seen all morning. She looked at the paper in her hand. She looked at Caleb Mercer, who was putting his hat back on and appeared to have nothing additional to say because he had said what needed saying. She looked at Mabel, and she thought about the flower that would last 4 more days, and the notice from Silas Crowley's office that was sitting on their kitchen table, and the boots that were letting in water from the left heel, and the way Mabel had stopped working on her sketches at night because she said the lamp oil was too expensive to waste on drawing. "We'll consider it," Rose said. It was not yes. She needed him to understand it was not yes. Caleb Mercer looked at her. "Take your time," he said. He moved toward the door, picked up his hat. He had set it on the edge of Webb's counter while he handled the fabric transaction, and stepped back out into the morning. The bell rang once. He was gone. The store remained silent for what felt like a very long time. Then Aldous Webb cleared his throat. "Mrs. Dalton," he said. "The thread. Would you like? I can wrap it with the other goods." Rose looked at him. She thought about the 2 spools of thread she had put back on his counter 2 minutes ago. She thought about the fact that he had watched everything that happened in this store and had said nothing, not one word, until the social geography had rearranged itself and silence had become more costly than speech. "No," she said. She purchased the thread herself, every cent, because Caleb Mercer had not purchased it for her, and she would not have Webb's belated courtesy standing in for her own money. She counted out the coins. She put the spools in her bag. She took Mabel's arm, and they walked out of Whitmore Dry Goods into the July morning the same way they had entered, together and upright. Behind them, Beatrice Langford stood very still in the center of the store, holding nothing now, the beautiful yellow dress and the perfect hair, and all the social architecture she had spent her life constructing, arranged around her the same as always. But something had shifted in the room that she could feel and not name. She had done what she always did. And this morning, for the first time she could remember, it hadn't worked. Outside, Rose unfolded the paper. On address. A set of directions. A list of the work he needed done, written in plain, direct handwriting with no flourishes. Mabel read over her shoulder. "He means it," Mabel said. "About the work." "Men say things," Rose said. "He wasn't saying things," Mabel said. "He was telling us something." Rose folded the paper. She put it in her purse. She looked down the main street of Willow Creek, where the morning was getting on with itself, horses at hitching rails, a wagon turning the corner near the feed store, 2 boys running across the unpaved road ahead of a dog who had more enthusiasm than speed. An ordinary Tuesday in an ordinary cattle town, except that this morning a man had walked into a store and looked at her sister's patched dress and said better than the tailor in Cheyenne, had said talent, had written down his address and handed it to the right sister without being asked which one to hand it to. "We'll go tomorrow," Rose said. Mabel said nothing, but Rose heard her exhale, and that was enough. They walked home with their thread and the address in Rose's purse, and something else, something harder to carry, because it was too new and too uncertain to trust yet, but too real to ignore. Something that might, if they were careful with it, turn out to be the beginning of something. The July sun pressed down on the wooden sidewalk. Rose didn't lower her head. Somewhere behind them, inside Whitmore Dry Goods, Beatrice Langford was beginning to understand that the 2 women she had just humiliated were going to be spoken about in this town for a very long time, and that her name was going to be part of that story, whether she chose it or not. The morning after Whitmore Dry Goods, Rose woke before dawn. She didn't lie there thinking. She wasn't a woman who lay in bed turning things over when she could be moving instead. She got up, put water on for coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with Caleb Mercer's paper unfolded in front of her and a stub of pencil she used for household accounting. She wrote 2 columns. On the left side, what they needed. On the right side, what they had. The left column was longer. It was always longer. Flour, salt pork, lamp oil, the boot repair she'd been putting off since April, the roof shingles above the bedroom corner that leaked when the rain came from the northeast. Below those, the thing she hadn't written down, but that was present in the room, the same way cold is present in a room even when you can't see it. The notice from Silas Crowley's office, sitting where she'd left it on the far edge of the table, face down. She hadn't shown Mabel that notice yet. She wasn't sure she was going to. She looked at the right column. Then she folded the paper with Caleb's address and put it in her apron pocket. When Mabel came down, her hair still loose over her shoulders and her eyes carrying that particular morning softness. She lost within an hour of being awake. Rose poured coffee and said, "We're going to Mercer Ridge today." Mabel sat down. She wrapped both hands around her cup. "You decided," she said. "I decided last night," Rose said. "I just wanted to sleep on it." "Did you sleep?" Rose looked at her. Mabel smiled into her coffee. They left at 7:30 in the wagon, the one their father had kept running through 17 years of bad weather and worse luck, and which now required a particular technique with the left rear brake that Rose had mastered through necessity and not choice. The drive north took just under an hour on the dry road, and neither of them talked much, which was fine. Rose and Mabel had always been comfortable in the same silence. What Rose was not comfortable with was the feeling she had been carrying since yesterday. Something uncomfortable and specific, the feeling of not knowing whether a man had been genuine. She had been wrong about genuine men before. She had been wrong about her father's business partner, who had borrowed money with a firm handshake and never returned it. She had been wrong about the church deacon who had offered to help them after their father's funeral, and whose version of help had required more gratitude than Rose was willing to produce. Caleb Mercer had not seemed like either of those men. But she had learned, painfully and at some cost, that seeming was not the same thing as being. She would watch. She would work. She would not decide anything about the man until she had seen him in his own territory, in his ordinary hours, when there was nothing to perform for. Mercer Ridge came into view gradually. First the fence line, then the outbuildings, then the main house set back from the road with the wide front porch and the two large cottonwoods flanking it. The place was substantial without being showy. Working land, you could see that immediately. Not a showpiece, but a functioning operation. Horses in the corral, ranch hands moving between buildings with the unhurried purpose of people who know their work and do it. A man came out to meet the wagon before Rose had fully stopped it. Not Caleb. A shorter man, older, with a weathered face and the bow-legged walk of someone who had spent decades on horseback. He introduced himself as Fletcher, the ranch foreman, and he did it with a directness that matched his employer's. "Mr. Mercer said to expect you," Fletcher said. "He's with the cattle this morning. He'll be back before noon. I can show you the house if you'd like to get started." Rose looked at him steadily. "We'd like to see the work before we agree to the terms," she said. Fletcher looked back at her with the same directness. "Fair enough," he said. He showed them through the ranch house with the brisk efficiency of a man accustomed to practical arrangements. The curtains throughout were indeed in poor shape, sun-faded and splitting at the rod casings, several simply missing. The bedding in the guest rooms had the look of things that had been laundered too many times with too much lye. There were 6 ranch hands who needed work shirts, 2 of whom had been making do with shirts that were beyond sensible repair. In the main room, a large settee covering needed replacing entirely. In the kitchen corridor, a stack of flour sacking that someone had been meaning to turn into useful linen for what appeared to be a considerable period of time. Mabel walked through each room without saying much, but Rose watched her sister's hands. Mabel's hands moved when her mind was working. Small, unconscious gestures, a thumb running along a seam edge, fingers testing the weight of fabric, the slight measuring motion she made with her index finger when she was calculating yardage in her head. By the time they had finished the tour, Mabel's hands had not been still once. Rose made her own notes. When Caleb Mercer came through the back door at 11:45, he was exactly what he had been in the store, the same man, without adjustment or performance. Dust on his hat, his forearms dark from morning sun, moving through his own house with the comfortable economy of someone who didn't think about where he was, because it was simply where he was. He stopped when he saw them. "You came," he said. "We came," Rose said. Something crossed his face. Not surprise exactly, but something adjacent to it, as if he had told himself not to expect them, and was now quietly glad to have been wrong. "Coffee?" he said. They sat at the large kitchen table. The same table, Rose later understood, where Caleb ate every meal, met with Fletcher, reviewed the ranch accounts, and conducted all business that did not require a formal office, which was all of it. He wasn't a man with a formal office. Rose presented her terms. She had written them on the back of his paper during the wagon ride north, in her careful, practical handwriting, because she had learned that agreements made in words dissolved more easily than agreements made in ink. Caleb read them. He didn't negotiate immediately. He read the full page. Rose respected that. "Your rate for the shirts is low," he said. Rose blinked. She had expected him to say the rate was high. She had set it at what she considered firm and fair and was prepared to hold it. She had not prepared for this particular response. "It's a fair rate," she said. "For ordinary shirts," Caleb said. "Fletcher tells me your sister already spent 20 minutes in the workroom calculating how to redesign the sleeve pattern so the hands can move more freely on horseback. That's not ordinary shirt work." He looked at Mabel. "Am I wrong?" Mabel, who had been sitting quietly with her hands around her cup, looked up. "The current pattern restricts the shoulder rotation," she said. "It's a small change to the cut, but it would make a significant difference over a full day's work." Caleb nodded. "Then the rate for the shirts should reflect that," he said. He crossed out Rose's number and wrote another one. Rose looked at it. She kept her expression steady with considerable effort. "We'll agree to those terms," she said. They shook hands across the kitchen table in Mercer Ridge Ranch, and Rose noticed that Caleb Mercer shook her hand the way he would have shaken any business partner's hand, firmly, briefly, without the slight softening that men sometimes introduced when they were shaking a woman's hand and couldn't quite decide how hard to do it. They began working that same afternoon. The first days were practical and full. Mabel established herself at the large work table in the room off the kitchen that had been used for storage and which Fletcher cleared without being asked twice. Rose worked through the household accounts, which she had not expected to be asked to do, but which Caleb placed in front of her on the second morning with a directness she was beginning to understand was simply how he operated. "Fletcher says you noticed the supply records needed organizing," he said. "I noticed the lamp oil and the salt purchases were being duplicated from 2 different accounts," Rose said. "It's a small thing." "It cost about $40 last year," Caleb said. Rose looked at him. "May I see the full ledger?" she said. He handed it to her without hesitation. It took her 3 days to work through it. She was not an accountant. She had learned what she knew about numbers from keeping her own household alive on too little money, which was, she would argue, the most rigorous accounting school available. But the problems in the Mercer Ridge ledger were not complicated. They were the problems of a man who was excellent at running cattle and not particularly interested in the administrative mechanics of running a business. Redundant purchases. Vendor invoices paid twice. A hay supplier whose rate had quietly increased 4% over 2 years without anyone catching it. She presented her findings to Caleb on a Thursday morning. He sat across from her and listened without interrupting, which was the quality she had already identified as the most unusual thing about him. Most men interrupted. They did it without noticing. Caleb Mercer had the particular discipline of a man who understood that other people often had information he didn't, and that interrupting them was a reliable way to remain ignorant. "That's close to $200 a year," he said when she finished. "More, if you renegotiate the hay contract," Rose said. He was quiet for a moment. "What would you want for keeping the accounts going forward?" he said. "In addition to the sewing work." "That's a separate conversation," Rose said. "It is," he agreed. "When would you like to have it?" "When I've decided whether I want to," she said. He accepted that. He did not push. He did not suggest that she was being unnecessarily difficult, or that the offer was generous and she should recognize it as such. He simply nodded and moved on to the question of whether the east pasture fence needed attention before the following week. That evening, driving home in the wagon with the sky going orange over the western ridge, Mabel sat beside Rose and didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "He's not what I expected." "No," Rose said. "What did you expect?" "I don't know." Rose kept her eyes on the road. "Something with an angle to it." "You still think there's an angle?" Rose thought about it honestly. "I think there might be a man who is genuinely what he appears to be," she said. "And I think that's almost harder to trust than the alternative, because I know what to do with the alternative." Mabel absorbed this. "I think you should trust him," she said. "I know you do. I think he looked at my dress yesterday the way Papa used to look at things that were made well," Mabel said. "Like it meant something to him that someone had taken the trouble." Rose said nothing, but she didn't disagree. The work at Mercer Ridge continued through the following 2 weeks with the kind of rhythm that develops when people are good at what they do and have stopped trying to prove it. Mabel finished 3 work shirts by the end of the first week. She delivered them to Fletcher with no particular announcement, and Fletcher distributed them to the hands that needed them most. And by the following morning, 2 of those hands had sought Mabel out directly, not to flatter her, but to ask whether she could adjust the cuffs. She could. She did. By the end of the second week, she had requests from 4 of the 6 hands for similar adjustments to shirts they had purchased in town. She was also halfway through the curtain work, having developed a pattern that used the available fabric more efficiently than the standard approach. And that would, she had explained to Rose in the wagon one evening, save enough material to produce 1 additional set from the same bolt. Rose had written it down in the ledger. That was the day Caleb asked Rose directly about her family's property situation. It happened simply and without preamble. They were reviewing the week's supply accounts after supper, Caleb and Rose, with the ledger between them and the evening coming through the window. When Caleb set his pen down and said, "Tell me about Silas Crowley." Rose looked up. She hadn't mentioned Crowley. She was certain she hadn't mentioned him. "What do you know about Silas Crowley?" she said. "Enough to ask," Caleb said. "Fletcher heard in town that Crowley's been sending notices to the Dalton property. I wanted to hear it from you." Rose sat back in her chair. She considered her options. She could decline to discuss it, which was her right, and which Caleb would accept without complaint, because she already knew that about him. She could give him the general outline without the details. Or she could simply tell him the truth, which was what she wanted to do, which was different from what she would usually do, which unsettled her. "He claims our father owed him $480, she said. "He's been claiming it since 4 months after our father died." "Has he produced documentation?" "A promissory note, our father's signature." "Do you believe it's genuine?" Rose met his eyes. "I believe our father was meticulous," she said. "I believe he kept records of everything he paid and everything he owed. And I believe that if he owed Silas Crowley $480, there would be a record of it somewhere in those papers, and I have been through those papers twice and I have not found one." Caleb was quiet. "Crowley's been buying land," he said. 11 properties in the last 3 years. Every one of them had some variety of debt claim attached to it. Every one of them settled at below market price. Rose felt something move through her that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anger. Something colder than either. "Our property," she said. "What does he want with it specifically?" "Creek access," Caleb said. "Your father's land has the only reliable water source in the lower valley that doesn't run dry by August. Crowley's been trying to consolidate grazing access for 2 years. Your property is the last piece." Rose sat very still. She thought about the notice face down on the kitchen table at home, and about the way she had chosen not to tell Mabel, because Mabel's hands had started moving again when she was sewing, and she hadn't wanted anything to stop that. "He offered me money last week," Rose said. Caleb looked at her sharply. "A man came to the house, said he was from Crowley's business office. He offered us $300 to settle the debt and vacate." $300, Caleb said. "I told him to leave." "Good," Caleb said. Then, more carefully, "Rose, this is going to escalate. Men like Crowley don't offer money and then accept the answer no. They moved to the next tool in the box. I know, Rose said. She did know. She had known since the morning the notice arrived. She had known, and she had continued getting up before dawn and making coffee and driving the wagon to Mercer Ridge and working through the ledger because there was nothing else to do except keep moving, and stopping felt more dangerous than whatever was coming. I want to help, Caleb said. I know that too, Rose said, but you won't let me. Not in the way you mean, she said. If we save our home, we save it because it belongs to us, not because another man with resources solved our problem for us. She paused. I mean no offense to you specifically. None taken, Caleb said. He sounded like he meant it. What I will accept, Rose said carefully, is information. If you know the legal mechanisms Crowley has been using and how other families have challenged them, that's something I can work with. Caleb thought for a moment. There's a lawyer in Cheyenne, he said. His name is Hargrove. He handled 2 of the property disputes Crowley touched last year. He knows how Crowley's documentation is structured. Can you get me his address? I can do that, Caleb said. He wrote it down that evening on the back of an invoice. When he handed it to her, he didn't add anything. No reassurance. No reminder that she should let him know if she needed more assistance. Just the name and the address, because those were what she had asked for. Rose folded the paper. She put it in her apron pocket, next to the worn place where the thread from the interior seam had started to go. She thought briefly, and without intending to, that she had misjudged him twice now. First in the store when she had assumed his offer contained an invisible debt, and just now when she had expected him to push back against her refusal of his help. He had not pushed either time. He had simply adjusted and continued forward, which was, she was beginning to understand, simply how the man moved through the world. She drove home that evening with the lawyer's address in her pocket and the last of the July light going flat and golden across the valley. When she got home, she sat at the kitchen table and unfolded the notice from Crowley's office and put it face up, and she told Mabel everything. Mabel listened without interrupting, which was different from how Mabel usually listened. She was a woman who asked questions, always had been, even as a girl, even when asking them made people impatient. But she listened to all of it in silence. When Rose finished, Mabel said, "Where are Papa's papers?" "In the cedar chest," Rose said. "I've been through them twice." "I know," Mabel said, "but you were looking for payments to Crowley." Rose looked at her sister. "What were you going to look for?" she said. "I was going to look at the numbers," Mabel said simply. "All of them, in order. The way a pattern works. You can't see where it's wrong if you only look at one piece." She got up from the table. She went to the back room where their father's cedar chest sat beneath an old quilt. She came back carrying a stack of papers that she set on the table with the same careful deliberateness she used when she set out her sewing materials. She lit the lamp because the evening had gotten on, and she moved the kerosene to a safer position at the table's edge, and she spread the first papers in front of her, and she began to look. Rose sat across from her and watched her sister's face in the lamplight. The slight tilt of her head, the way her lips moved very slightly when she was counting, the small, precise movements of her fingers as she organized and reordered and cross-referenced with the quiet concentration of someone for whom this kind of detail was not work at all. It was nearly 10 o'clock when Mabel looked up. Her expression was very still. "Rose," she said, "what did you find?" Mabel turned one of the papers so Rose could see it. She pointed to a column of figures, dates, amounts, notations in their father's familiar economical handwriting. "Papa made payments," Mabel said. 11 of them over 3 years. The last one is dated 8 months before he died. "I saw those," Rose said. "There's no receipt, no acknowledgement from Crowley." "No," Mabel said. "But look." She pointed to a notation beside the third payment. Papa wrote initials next to each one. HP. Do you know what that means? Rose shook her head. "I think HP is the person who received the payments," Mabel said. "Not Crowley directly. Someone who worked for him." She looked up. If Papa paid someone in Crowley's office and that person recorded it, there would be a record. Not in Crowley's books, in theirs. The lamplight moved slightly in a draft from the window. Rose looked at the papers on the table. She looked at her sister. Mabel's shoulders were straight. Her voice had not wavered. She was looking at Rose with the same calm certainty she had when she had a pattern she trusted. HP, Rose said. HP, Mabel said. We need to find out who that is. Yes, Mabel said. She looked back at the papers. And I think, she said slowly, that we are not the only family who should be looking. The initials HP kept Rose awake until 2 in the morning. She lay in the dark with the ceiling above her and her father's papers organized in her mind the way she organized ledger columns, by date, by amount, by what connected to what. 11 payments. 3 years. Each one marked with the same 2 letters in her father's careful hand. He had been precise about money his entire life. He had never written down anything he didn't mean to remember. HP was a person, and that person had taken their father's money and either failed to record it or deliberately removed the record afterward. She got up at 4:30. Mabel was already in the kitchen. She hadn't slept either. She was sitting at the table with the papers still spread around her, the lamp turned low, a cup of cold coffee at her elbow. She had her small notebook open, the one she normally used for sewing patterns, precise measurements and calculations rendered in her tight, economical handwriting, and she had filled 4 pages with figures. Rose looked over her shoulder without speaking. Mabel had reconstructed the payment timeline in full. Not just their father's payments to HP, but the dates of Crowley's property acquisitions that Rose had learned from the county filing notices, the ones she had copied down at the courthouse 3 weeks ago without being entirely sure why. She had laid them side by side. Every acquisition followed within 6 months of a debt claim. Every debt claim appeared after a property owner had died or become too ill to manage their own affairs. "How long did this take you?" Rose said. "I didn't time it," Mabel said. "Mabel." "Since you went to bed." Mabel looked up. "Rose, it's not just us. Look at the Hendersons. Look at the Barker widow. Every single one of them received a claim within the first year of losing the head of household. Every single one used the same document language." Rose pulled out a chair. She sat down and looked at the notebook. The pattern was unmistakable when laid out the way Mabel had laid it out. Not one opportunistic claim, a system. A deliberate, repeated mechanism designed to operate on families when they were most vulnerable and least likely to have the resources to fight. "He picked people who couldn't push back," Rose said. "He picked people he thought couldn't push back," Mabel said. It was a small distinction. It was the most important distinction. Rose looked at her sister in the low lamplight. The dark circles under her eyes, the ink on 2 of her fingers from writing through the night, the absolute steadiness of her expression, and felt something move through her chest that she didn't have a name for. Something between grief and pride, pressed so close together they were almost indistinguishable. "We're going to Cheyenne," Rose said. "To the lawyer. To Hargrove. And I want to bring all of this." Rose gestured at the papers. "Everything you've put together. We're not going to him with one family's problem." Mabel looked at the notebook. "We need the other families," she said. "Yes. They may not want to talk to us." "I know," Rose said, "but we're going to ask anyway." They asked. It was not easy, and it was not fast. The Barker widow, whose name was Cora, lived 4 miles east on a farm that had gone to hard use since her husband's death 18 months prior. She answered the door holding a baby on her hip and a toddler attached to her left leg, and looked at the 2 sisters on her porch with the particular wariness of a woman who had learned that strangers arriving at her door generally wanted something she didn't have to give. Rose told her why they were there directly, the way she did everything. No softening, no extended preamble, just the facts laid out plainly in the order that made the most sense. Cora Barker listened. Then she said, "He told me if I didn't settle by the end of August, he'd file to take the property." "When did you receive that notice?" Rose said. 6 weeks after Thomas died." Cora shifted the baby to her other hip. "I asked him to show me the original debt note. His man said I could view it at their office in town, but I'd have to come during business hours, which means I'd have to find someone to watch the children, which I don't have." She paused. "I thought I was the only one." "You're not," Rose said. Something changed in Cora Barker's face. Not immediately. It moved through her slowly, the way feeling comes back into a limb that's been cold. She stepped back from the door. "You'd better come in," she said. The Henderson family was harder. Martin Henderson was 63 and had lost his wife and his eldest son to the same fever the previous winter. And the double grief had done something to his face, that grief of that particular accumulation does. Hollowed it, settled it into a kind of permanent weight. He did not want to talk about Crowley. He did not want to look at Mabel's notebook. He said he had already spoken to a man at Crowley's office about a payment arrangement, and he didn't see any reason to make trouble. "Mr. Henderson," Rose said, "my father made 11 payments to a man in Crowley's office over 3 years. Not one of them appears in Crowley's records. He's claiming the full amount as though it was never touched." Henderson looked at her. "My father is dead," Rose said. "He can't tell us he paid it. All he left us was the record that he did, and someone removed that record from Crowley's books." A long silence. "My wife kept our payment records," Henderson said finally. "She kept everything." He stopped. "I haven't looked through her desk since she passed." "May we?" Mabel said. He looked at her. She met his eyes steadily, not with pity, not with the urgent pressure of someone who needed something from him. With the same quiet directness that Rose was only now recognizing as one of her sister's most powerful qualities. Henderson got up and walked to the back room. He came out with a small wooden box. He set it on the table and opened it and stepped back, as if looking at it directly was still more than he could manage. Inside, in tidy paper-wrapped bundles tied with kitchen string, were every financial record Margaret Henderson had kept for 14 years. Mabel sat down and opened the first bundle. Her hands moved with the careful precision she brought to everything that required it, and within 20 minutes she had found what they needed. 6 payment records, each signed by the same receiving party, the same initials pressed in ink at the bottom of each receipt. H.P. Henderson sat very still when Mabel showed him. "She wrote down everything," he said. Not to them, to himself. "She did," Mabel said. "And it saved you." He looked up at that. "It saved all of us," Rose said. They found 2 more families before the end of the week. Each visit followed the same rough shape. Initial wariness, then recognition, then the particular quality of anger that comes when someone discovers they have not been uniquely targeted but systematically chosen. That anger was more useful than individual outrage. It had a direction to it. By Thursday, Rose had a collection of documentation that she spread across Caleb's kitchen table because it was the largest flat surface available, and she needed to lay it all out to see the full shape of what they had. Caleb stood across the table and didn't touch any of it. "You did all this in 5 days," he said. "Mabel did most of it," Rose said. He looked at Mabel. Mabel looked back at him from across the table with her notebook and her stack of organized papers and the expression of someone who has been working at full capacity and knows it. "The initials HP, Caleb said. "Do you know who that is?" "Not yet," Rose said. Caleb picked up his coffee cup. He looked at the pattern Mabel had drawn in the notebook. The timeline laid out with dates and names and amounts connected by lines showing the relationships between Crowley's claims and the property acquisitions that followed. "Harold Prentice," he said. Both sisters looked at him. "He was Crowley's head bookkeeper until 2 years ago," Caleb said. "Then Crowley moved him to a different position, his private holdings office, not the main business. Separate from everything public-facing." "You know him?" Rose said. "I know of him," Caleb said. "I know he left Crowley's employ about 8 months ago. I don't know why. Fletcher might know more. He hears things I don't." He set down the cup. "I'll ask Fletcher today," he said. Fletcher knew considerably more. He came to the kitchen doorway 2 hours later, while Rose and Mabel were still working through the documents, and he stood with his hat in his hands and told them that Harold Prentice had left Crowley's employment following a disagreement about record-keeping practices, that he was currently living in a rooming house in Laramie, and that he had, according to the feed store owner whose cousin had worked with Prentice, expressed regrets about his time with Crowley's company to at least 2 people within the past year. Mabel looked up from her notebook. He feels guilty, she said. Sounds like it, Fletcher said. That means he might talk, Rose said. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then Caleb said, I'll go to Laramie. No, Rose said immediately. He looked at her. A wealthy rancher arriving at this man's door will either frighten him or put him on his guard, Rose said. He doesn't know you. He doesn't owe you anything. He has no reason to trust you. She paused. But he might talk to two women who can show him the evidence that the records he kept were altered after he left. Because if they were altered after he left, then he isn't responsible for the alterations. And that might matter to a man who's been feeling guilty. Caleb was quiet. You've thought about this, he said. I've been thinking about very little else for 4 days, Rose said. Another pause. All right, he said. They went to Laramie on Saturday. Caleb drove them. Rose had accepted that, because the road was long and the wagon was unreliable at distance. But he remained with the horses at the edge of the street while the sisters walked to the rooming house alone, which had been Rose's condition and which Caleb had accepted without argument. Harold Prentice was a small, thin man in his early 50s, with the look of someone who had not been sleeping well for an extended period. He answered the door of his room in his shirt sleeves and looked at the two women standing in the corridor with the expression of a person who has been expecting a consequence for long enough that its actual arrival feels almost like relief. Mr. Prentice, Rose said. My name is Rose Dalton. This is my sister Mabel. Our father's name was George Dalton. He made payments to you over a period of 3 years. We have the records. Prentice looked at them. He stepped back from the door. He said, I was wondering when someone would come. He told them everything, not all at once, and not without pauses in which he looked at his hands, or at the floor, or at the window, in the way of a man who has been carrying something heavy and is experiencing the complicated sensation of setting it down. But he told them. The payments had been real. Their father had paid. Prentice had recorded it. He had maintained accurate records for the entirety of his employment with Crowley's company, which had extended over 9 years, and which had, he said, been ordinary accounting work until approximately 4 years ago, when Crowley had begun the property acquisition strategy and had instructed Prentice to structure the debt records in ways that Prentice had found increasingly difficult to reconcile with honest bookkeeping. He told me it was legal, Prentice said. That debt restructuring after a borrower's death was a standard commercial practice. I didn't know enough law to argue otherwise. But you knew it wasn't right, Mabel said. Prentice looked at her. Yes, he said. I knew it wasn't right. When did you leave? Rose said. When he told me to remove payments from records that I had personally received and personally recorded, Prentice said. Your father's payments, the Henderson payments, others. He said the new records would reflect the original debt amount as still outstanding. I told him I wouldn't do it. He stopped. He told me I already had. The room was absolutely still. He had someone else alter the records, Rose said. After you refused. After he told me I had no choice and I walked out, Prentice said. Yes, I assume so. I don't know who he used. But you kept copies, Mabel said. She said it quietly, without accusation, in the tone of someone who already knew the answer and simply needed him to confirm it. Prentice looked at her for a long moment. Then he got up. He crossed to the wardrobe on the far wall of the room and opened the lower door and reached toward the back and produced a flat document case. The kind used for business papers, leather-bound, secured with a small brass clasp. He held it out to Rose. I kept copies of everything, he said. From the day he first told me to begin restructuring, I didn't know what I was going to do with them. I told myself I was keeping them for my own protection, but I think... He stopped. He looked at the document case. I think I was keeping them because I hoped someone would eventually ask. Rose took the document case. Her hands were completely steady. Will you testify? She said. Prentice sat back down. He looked at his hands in the particular way of a man taking the full measure of a decision. Crowley will destroy whatever he can of my reputation, he said. Probably, Rose said. He has lawyers, expensive ones. I know, Rose said. We have the truth, and we have you, and we have 5 families' worth of original payment records that he doesn't know exist. She held up the document case. And we have these. Prentice looked at her. You're not frightened, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I'm frightened every single day, Rose said. I have been since my father died. I am frightened right now. She didn't lower her voice or soften it. But I've learned that frightened and stopped are not the same thing, and I intend to remain very clear on that difference. Prentice was quiet for a long time. Then, yes, he said. I'll testify. They drove back from Laramie with the document case on the seat between them and Caleb asking no questions about what had happened inside the rooming house, because he had understood, without being told, that it wasn't his to ask about until Rose was ready to tell him. She told him at the ranch, at the kitchen table, with the document case open between them and Mabel sitting across with her notebook. The same notebook, the same table, the same lamp, the same quiet competence that had been the foundation of everything they'd built in the past 2 weeks. Caleb looked at the contents of the document case. He went through each paper carefully, in order, with the methodical attention he brought to everything that mattered. When he finished, he sat back. This is enough, he said. For the county hearing? Rose said. For a great deal more than the county hearing, Caleb said. This is enough to end Crowley's property acquisition scheme entirely. If Hargrove sees these... He stopped. He looked at Rose. This needs to go to Hargrove before the end of next week. The hearing's in 12 days. I know, Rose said. I've already written to him. Caleb looked at her. I wrote yesterday, Rose said, before we went to Laramie. I wanted the appointment secured before we knew whether Prentice would cooperate, in case we needed to move quickly. A beat of silence. You wrote before you knew, Caleb said. I planned for the possibility that it would go well, Rose said, because the alternative was not acceptable. Something moved across Caleb's face. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. Something she was beginning to recognize as what happened when she did something that caught him genuinely off guard. He looked down at the papers. All right, he said. 3 days later, Crowley moved. Rose and Mabel came home from Mercer Ridge on a Wednesday evening to find their front fence broken at the post. Not wind damage, not ordinary wear, but cut. The wire ends were clean, and their livestock gate, the one they kept latched with a specific system Rose had devised after a bad experience 2 years prior, was standing open. The 2 chickens they kept were gone. The small pen where they housed them was undamaged, just empty. Mabel stood at the gate and said nothing. Rose looked at the clean wire ends of the broken fence post. He knows we went to Laramie, she said. Or he knows we went to the Henderson farm, Mabel said. Or the Barkers. Someone told him something. It doesn't matter which, Rose said. What matters is that he's moved from legal pressure to something else. They fixed the fence that evening. Rose sent a note to Caleb the following morning, not asking for help, but informing him, because he had the right to know that the situation had changed in character. Caleb arrived before noon. He looked at the fence post. He looked at the gate. He did not suggest moving them to the ranch, which Rose would have refused. He did not suggest hiring someone to watch the property, which she also would have refused. He stood there and he thought, and then he said, Fletcher's nephew lives 2 miles north. He's 17 and reliable. He could ride past twice a day. That would be acceptable, Rose said. He nodded. Then he said, Rose, the rumors have started. She looked at him. In town, he said. About you, about Mabel. Someone is saying that you've been manipulating my household accounts for personal gain. That you've been... He stopped. He appeared to be choosing words with care. That your interest in my situation has not been professional. The air between them was very still. Are you asking me whether it's true? Rose said. No, Caleb said immediately. I'm telling you what's being said, so you're not caught off guard when it reaches you directly, which it will. Rose looked at him steadily. It's Crowley, she said. Almost certainly, Caleb said. He can't attack the documents because he doesn't know exactly what you have, so he's attacking your credibility. Make the community doubt you before the hearing. And Beatrice Langford is repeating it, Rose said. It wasn't a question. She had seen the pattern before. Not this specific one, but the general shape of it. The way social damage moved through a small town, and who carried it most efficiently. Yes, Caleb said. Rose was quiet. She thought about the store. The laughter. The patches on Mabel's dress, and the way Mabel's shoulders had begun to fold inward, and the feeling of her sister's fingers closing on her sleeve. She thought about the morning they had walked back out of Whitmore Dry Goods with their thread and their dignity, and $2 less certainty than she had hoped for. She thought about Mabel working through their father's papers at the kitchen table at 2 a.m. with cold coffee and a notebook, and the absolute, unshakable conviction that the pattern would reveal itself if she looked at it correctly. She thought about Cora Barker with her baby on her hip and her toddler at her knee, saying, "I thought I was the only one." "Then we'll go to town," Rose said. Caleb blinked. "When?" he said. "Tomorrow," Rose said. "Mabel has clothing orders to deliver." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "You don't need to come," Rose said. "I know," Caleb said. He came anyway. He didn't walk beside them down the main street. He walked behind them, a step or two back, because that was the right distance, present but not leading, visible but not directing. Rose understood it without being told. She and Mabel walked into Whitmore Dry Goods together. The bell rang twice, the way it always did. The store had perhaps 8 people in it. The conversations didn't stop this time. They shifted, which was a different thing. A lowering of voices, a movement of eyes. Beatrice Langford was near the fabric display. She always was. She looked at the sisters enter. She looked at Mabel. Her gaze went, by habit, Rose thought, by pure entrenched habit, to Mabel's dress. It stopped there. Because Mabel was wearing something different. It was dark blue, the color of the sky at that particular hour between afternoon and evening when the light goes deep. The cut was clean and precise at the collar. The sleeves sat exactly as they should. There was nothing ornamented about it, nothing decorative for its own sake, but the shape of it was perfect in the way that only comes from someone who understood fabric not as material, but as architecture. Mabel had made it herself. Every stitch. She had worked on it in the evenings after they came home from Mercer Ridge, after the papers were put away and the lamp was burning low, in the last hour before she was too tired to see clearly. Rose had watched her sometimes, sitting at the small table in the corner of their room, her needle moving with the same precise rhythm as always, making something beautiful from the bolts Caleb had purchased that morning in this same store. Mabel walked to the counter. She set down the wrapped package she was carrying. Beatrice found her voice. "Did your cowboy finally buy you something respectable?" she said. The old pattern, the familiar blade. Mabel looked at her. "No," she said. One word, clear, unadorned. "I made it," Mabel said. She unwrapped the package on the counter. Inside were 4 garments. A riding jacket, 2 day dresses, and a work shirtwaist. Each completed with the same precision as what Mabel was wearing. Each designed with the functional intelligence that was Mabel's particular genius. She laid them out on the counter without performance or explanation. The women near the ribbon display moved closer. One of them, Mrs. Alderman, whose husband ran the largest livestock operation east of town, picked up the riding jacket and turned it over in her hands. "Who designed this pattern?" she said. "I did," Mabel said. Mrs. Alderman looked at the shoulder seam, then the front closure, then the lining, which she turned back with careful fingers. "I've been trying to find a riding jacket that fits properly since my tailor in Kansas City retired," she said. "I want one of these." "I can make you one," Mabel said. "When?" "Give me your measurements today, and I can have it ready in 3 weeks." Mrs. Alderman looked at her, the same Mabel Dalton she had watched leave this store 2 months ago, with her head lowered and her sister's sleeve clutched in her fingers. The same woman. Different posture. Same eyes, which had always been steady if you had ever looked at them properly. "All right," Mrs. Alderman said. Then another woman asked. Then another. Beatrice Langford stood at the center of the store and watched the 2 sisters she had tried to break stand at the counter of Whitmore Dry Goods and take 4 clothing orders in 15 minutes. She didn't laugh. She didn't say anything else. She looked at Mabel's dark blue dress, the one Mabel had made herself, with thread purchased with their own money, cut from fabric. Caleb Mercer had bought on the morning he had walked into this store and decided that two women deserved better than what this room had given them. And for the first time, Beatrice Langford looked like she understood the cost of what she had done. Not forgiven. That was not where they were, and Rose knew it, and Mabel knew it. But seen. And seeing the cost was its own kind of reckoning. Rose waited while Mabel finished the last order. She was aware of Caleb somewhere behind her, not turning to check, not needing to, simply knowing he was there. The way you know the temperature of a room has changed even when you're not looking for the reason. She looked at the counter where Aldous Webb was watching the proceedings with the expression of a man who was performing a very rapid internal reassessment. She looked at Mabel, who was writing measurements in her notebook with the same steady hand that had worked through their father's papers at 2 in the morning and reconstructed Crowley's entire scheme from numbers and dates and initials pressed in ink at the bottom of a receipt. The hearing was in 9 days. Harold Prentice would be there. The document case was at Mercer Ridge, locked in Caleb's strongbox because that was the safest place, and Rose had decided to trust him with it. And Mabel, standing at that counter in the dress she had made herself, was taking clothing orders from the wives of the men who would be sitting in that courtroom. Sometimes, Rose thought, the ground shifts before anyone thinks to announce it. 9 days. Rose counted them the way she counted everything that mattered. Not with dread, but with the cold practicality of a woman who had learned that time was a resource like any other, and wasting it on fear was the same as wasting flour on a day you weren't baking. She and Mabel drove to Mercer Ridge every morning. They worked. They came home. In the evenings, Rose reviewed the documents from Prentice's case, while Mabel sewed by lamplight, filling clothing orders that had multiplied since the afternoon at Whitmore Dry Goods. Mrs. Alderman had told 2 friends. Those 2 had told others. The pattern of it moved through Willow Creek the same way everything moved through a small town. Faster than anyone intended, and in directions nobody fully predicted. On the 4th evening before the hearing, Rose found an envelope under their door. No name on the outside. No postmark. Someone had placed it there directly, which meant someone had been at their door without knocking, which meant someone had not wanted to be seen. She opened it at the kitchen table while Mabel watched. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 6 words written in an unfamiliar hand. Drop the case. Leave Willow Creek. Mabel read it over her shoulder. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Mabel said, "He's scared." "Yes," Rose said. "Scared men do stupid things," Mabel said. "Yes," Rose said again. She folded the paper and put it in the document case with everything else. "That's why we're not going to react to it." She went to bed at her usual hour. She did not sleep well, but she went to bed at her usual hour because maintaining the shape of ordinary life when someone was trying to destabilize it was its own form of resistance, and Rose Dalton had been practicing that form of resistance since she was 19 years old. She told Caleb about the note the following morning. He looked at it. His expression didn't change much, but something around his eyes tightened in a way she was learning to read. "He knows the hearing is close," Caleb said. "That's what Mabel said." "Mabel's right." He handed the paper back. "I'm going to ask Fletcher to have his nephew ride past your property twice instead of once." "All right," Rose said. He looked at her. "You're not going to argue about that," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "A note under my door in the dark is a different category of threat than a broken fence post," Rose said. "I know the difference." He nodded. There was a pause. The comfortable kind. The kind that had been developing between them over weeks of early mornings and shared ledger pages and conversations that started about one thing and became something else without either of them deciding to let that happen. "Rose," he said. She looked at him. He seemed to be working out how to say something, which was unusual for him. He was generally a man who said what he meant in the order it occurred to him. "After the hearing," he said. She waited. "I'd like to discuss something with you that isn't about the ranch accounts." She looked at him steadily. "After the hearing," she said. "Yes," he said. "Ask me then," she said. Something loosened slightly in his expression. He nodded once and picked up his coffee cup, and the moment moved on, and Rose turned back to the ledger and did not let herself think about it again until much later, when she was driving home in the evening and the road was quiet and Mabel was half asleep against her shoulder. Then she let herself think about it for exactly the length of time it took to turn into their property gate. Then she put it away. The hearing was in 5 days. Everything else could wait. On the third day before the hearing, Crowley made his second move. It came through Beatrice Langford, which surprised Rose less than it probably should have. She was at the dry goods store. She had begun conducting errands there without hesitation. Because hesitation was a gift, she had decided to stop giving to people who didn't deserve it. When Beatrice appeared beside her at the counter with the particular arrangement of features that meant she was about to say something she had rehearsed. "Miss Dalton," Beatrice said. Rose looked at her. "I've heard some things," Beatrice said, "about the hearing, about what you've been doing." "I imagine you have," Rose said. Beatrice glanced around the store, lowered her voice. "Crowley knows about the Prentice man," she said. "He knows you went to Laramie. He knows what he told you." Rose's hands stilled on the counter. She kept her face completely neutral. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. Beatrice looked at the counter surface. It was the first time in Rose's memory that Beatrice Langford had failed to hold eye contact during an uncomfortable conversation. She was a woman who weaponized eye contact the way other people weaponized raised voices. "Because he asked me to," Beatrice said. "He asked me to tell you that he knows, that whatever Prentice said to you, he has his own lawyers and his own documents, and that if you appear at that hearing with what you think you have—" She stopped. "He said he would make certain your reputation in this county was finished." The store was quiet around them. "Let me be certain I understand," Rose said. Her voice was even and unhurried. "Silas Crowley used you to deliver a threat. He asked me to—" "He used you," Rose said. "He decided you were someone who could be relied upon to walk up to another woman and say something that frightens you to say because you already know it's wrong. And you walked in here and you're doing it." She looked at Beatrice directly. "Is that what you want to be?" The silence stretched. Beatrice said nothing. "I'm going to that hearing," Rose said. "I'm going to bring everything we have. And I would suggest, Miss Langford, that you think very carefully about which side of that room you want people to remember you standing on." She picked up her wrapped parcel and walked to the door. Behind her, she heard Beatrice say, very quietly, "He told me your sister would lose her orders, that he'd tell people she was a fraud." Rose stopped. She turned. Beatrice was still at the counter, and she looked, for the first time, perhaps the first time Rose had ever observed, like someone who was genuinely frightened. Not of Rose, of herself, of what she'd been carrying into that store. "Then come to the hearing," Rose said. "And when you're there, decide what a person who isn't afraid of Silas Crowley would do." She left. She drove directly to Mercer Ridge. She told Caleb what Beatrice had said in full, without softening or editorializing, because he needed the accurate information. He listened with his elbows on the kitchen table and his coffee growing cold. "He knows about Prentice," Caleb said when she finished. "Yes. Which means he's had someone watching, either us or Prentice." "Or both," Rose said. "Does Prentice know?" "Not yet." Caleb pushed back from the table. "We need to send word to Hargrove tonight," he said. "If Crowley knows what Prentice has, he may try to pressure him before the hearing." "I thought of that on the drive here," Rose said. "I need you to ride to Prentice, not me. If someone's watching, they've already noted how many times I've been to Laramie. You going is different. You're a rancher with business in the area. It raises fewer questions." He looked at her. "You need me to go," he said. "Not a challenge, just noting it." "I need you to go," she confirmed. "Tonight, if you can." He stood up. "I can," he said. He left within the hour, and Rose sat at his kitchen table with Mabel and the document case, and the organized evidence of everything they had built in the past 3 weeks, and she worked. Because that was what you did when the ground was uncertain. You worked on the things you could control until you had done everything it was possible to do. Caleb returned from Laramie the following afternoon. He came into the kitchen without taking his hat off first, which meant the news was immediate. Prentice had a visitor last night, he said. 2 men. They told him if he testified, they'd file a complaint with the territorial bar, claiming he had falsified records during his employment, and they had documentation. Mabel looked up from her sewing. Rose put her pen down. Did he believe them? Rose said. I was frightened, Caleb said. He's still frightened. But he showed me what they left him. A letter, unsigned, claiming he had altered accounts for personal gain. Can they prove it? Rose said. No, Caleb said, because it isn't true. But proving a negative takes time and resources that Prentice doesn't have, and Crowley knows it. He dropped into the chair across from Rose. He told me he needed to think. The kitchen was very quiet. Mabel set her sewing down on the table. He kept those documents for 2 years, she said. He didn't throw them away. He didn't pretend he never saw what he saw. He kept them because he was already planning to do the right thing. He just needed the moment to arrive. She looked at Rose. He'll come. You don't know that, Rose said. I know what it looks like when a person has been waiting to tell the truth, Mabel said. He had that look. Rose looked at Caleb. Your sister is either very perceptive or very optimistic, he said. Both, Rose said. 3 in the morning, and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of water. Not coffee, she needed her hands steady and her mind clean, not accelerated. And she went through every document one final time, not looking for new information, confirming what she already had, making certain that the shape of the case she and Mabel had built was as solid as she believed it to be. Mabel found her there at 5. She sat down across from her sister without saying anything, and for a while they just sat together in the early morning dark, the way they had sat together through every hard night since their father died. Rose and Mabel, the Dalton sisters, the women everyone in Willow Creek had decided were a manageable quantity. Are you scared? Mabel said finally. Yes, Rose said. What are you scared of specifically? Rose thought about it honestly. That it won't be enough, she said. That we've done everything right and built the best case we could build, and Crowley's lawyers will find a way to make it not enough. That Prentice won't come. That the families will back down. That the county commissioner will decide that a wealthy businessman is a more reliable authority than 2 women and a former bookkeeper. She paused. That's what I'm scared of. Mabel was quiet. And if that happens, she said, then we find another way, Rose said. But I would rather it not come to that. Mabel reached across the table and put her hand over Rose's. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. They arrived at the county hall at 8:30 in the morning in their best clothes, with the document case between them and Caleb Mercer walking beside Rose on her left side, not ahead of her. Fletcher had come, and Mrs. Alderman, and 2 other ranch wives who had heard enough in the past week to understand what this hearing was actually about. Cora Barker was there with her oldest child beside her, because she had no one to leave him with, and had come anyway. Martin Henderson was there, sitting stiffly in the back row, with his wife's payment records in a folder on his lap, and his face carrying the weight of a man who had decided to stop letting grief make his decisions for him. The room filled. Crowley arrived with 3 lawyers and the particular ease of a man who had never had reason to doubt that rooms arranged themselves in his favor. He was broad and well-dressed and did not look at the Dalton sisters when he entered, which Rose noted. Men who ignored you in a room they expected to control were men who had already decided you weren't a threat. That was fine with her. The county commissioner, a heavy-set man named Aldous Briggs, who had held the position for 11 years and who Rose had researched through Hargrove, was reputed to be honest. Not fearless, but honest, which was the more useful quality in a man who had to live in the same county as Silas Crowley for the foreseeable future. Hargrove was already at the front table when they arrived, and he turned when he saw Rose and gave her a brief nod that communicated more than most people's extended reassurances. He was a lean, precise man in his 60s who had been practicing law in Wyoming Territory for 30 years, and who had told Rose, on their first meeting, that the evidence she had assembled was the most methodical private documentation he had seen outside a professional accounting firm. Rose had thought about Mabel for the rest of that day. The hearing began at 9 o'clock. Crowley's lead lawyer, a man named Whitfield, who had the polished confidence of someone accustomed to rooms like this one. Opened by presenting the debt documentation against the Dalton estate, the promissory note, the outstanding balance, the legal mechanism for property recovery under territorial law. It was presented cleanly and efficiently, and Rose watched Commissioner Briggs's face while it was presented and saw the particular neutrality of a man who was listening and not yet deciding. Then Hargrove stood up. He presented the Dalton payment records first, their father's meticulous notations, the dates, the amounts, the initials, HP, beside each entry. Then the receipts from the Henderson family. Then the Barker records. Then 2 additional families who had provided documentation in the past week. He laid each one out in the order. Mabel had organized them, chronologically, cross-referenced, mapped against Crowley's property acquisitions in a timeline that made the pattern impossible to misread. Whitfield objected 4 times. Briggs overruled 3 of them. Then Hargrove called his first witness. Cora Barker walked to the front of the room with her back straight and her hands still, and she told the commissioner that she had received a debt claim 6 weeks after her husband's death, that she had payment records showing settlement of the original debt, and that she had been told by Crowley's representative that her documentation was invalid because it predated the current claim structure. "In plain language, Mrs. Barker," Hargrove said, "what were you told?" "I was told my husband's word meant nothing because he was dead," Cora said. The room went very quiet. Whitfield stood immediately. "Commissioner, this is—" "Sit down, Mr. Whitfield," Briggs said. Martin Henderson testified next. He was slower, more deliberate, his voice carrying the roughness of a man who had not spoken publicly about his grief before and was doing it now because he had decided it was necessary. He described the payment records his wife had kept. He described the conversation with Crowley's representative that had told him the records were likely forged. He described the moment when Mabel Dalton had sat down at his kitchen table and shown him his wife's handwriting on a receipt that proved every payment had been made. "Your wife's records saved your property, Mr. Henderson?" Hargrove said. "My wife's records saved everything," Henderson said. He sat down. Whitfield began his cross-examination with the practiced ease of a man who believed he still controlled the room. He questioned the authenticity of the payment records. He questioned the chain of custody of the documentation. He questioned whether any of the witnesses could independently verify that the payments had reached Crowley's company and not simply a third party who had accepted money without passing it along. It was a reasonable argument. Rose sat with her hands in her lap and watched Crowley's lawyer build it. And then the door at the back of the room opened. Harold Prentice walked in. He was wearing his good coat, which Rose could tell because it was slightly too formal for the rest of him, and he was carrying a leather document case that matched the one in Rose's possession because they were identical, the same type, from the same supplier, ordered by the same company. He walked to the front of the room without looking at Crowley, and he took the witness position. And he told Commissioner Briggs that he had served as head bookkeeper for Silas Crowley's company for 9 years, that he had personally received and recorded payments from 6 families over the course of 3 years, that those payments had been reflected in the company records during his tenure, and that he had been instructed by Silas Crowley to remove those records 14 months before his resignation. He opened his document case. He produced the copies, the originals that he had retained on the day Crowley had told him to alter them. He placed them on Hargrove's table one at a time, in order, without drama, with the quiet certainty of a man who had been waiting 2 years to do this, and had not been entirely sure he was brave enough until this morning. Whitfield was on his feet. "Commissioner, this witness was dismissed from his position for cause. There are outstanding allegations of record falsification against—" "Do you have documentation of those allegations?" Briggs said. Whitfield paused. "The documentation is being assembled." "So no," Briggs said. "Commissioner." "Mr. Whitfield." Briggs's voice was flat and final. "You'll have your opportunity for cross-examination. Sit down." Whitfield sat. Crowley, for the first time since entering the room, looked at the Dalton sisters. Rose held his gaze. She did not look away. She did not adjust her expression. She simply looked at him with the steady, unhurried attention of a woman who had driven through Wyoming Territory nights and worked through other people's financial records by lamplight and stood at the kitchen table at 3 in the morning, and decided that frightened and stopped were not the same thing. He looked away first. Prentice testified for 40 minutes. He was methodical. He was precise. He answered every question Hargrove asked him in plain language, and every question Whitfield asked him with the patient exactitude of someone who had already lived with these facts for 2 years and had no fear of being asked about them again. Then Mabel was called. Rose felt something tighten in her chest when Mabel stood up, because this was Mabel, her quiet sister, the one who had spent years learning to take up as little space as possible in rooms that decided she didn't belong. And this room was asking her to take up as much space as she could, and Rose didn't know if she was ready. And she hated that she didn't know, and she kept her hands very still in her lap. Mabel walked to the front. She sat in the witness position. She put her notebook on the table. Hargrove said, "Miss Dalton, will you describe for the commissioner what you found when you examined your family's financial records?" Mabel opened her notebook. She described it the way she described a pattern. From the beginning, in order, each element connected to the next by its logical relationship. The payment notations in their father's handwriting. The initials. The cross-referencing she had done with the Henderson and Barker records. The timeline she had constructed showing the relationship between Crowley's debt claims and his subsequent property acquisitions. She was calm and clear, and she never raised her voice. Whitfield cross-examined her. He questioned her qualifications. He questioned her analytical methods. He suggested that a dressmaker's interpretation of financial records was not comparable to professional accounting analysis. "You design clothing, Miss Dalton," he said. "Is that correct?" "Yes," Mabel said. "And you have no formal training in accounting or finance?" "No," Mabel said. "Then perhaps you can explain to the commissioner why your analysis of these documents should be considered reliable?" Mabel looked at him. She looked at him the way she looked at a flawed seam, with calm, complete attention, as if she had all the time in the world, and the answer was simply a matter of examining it correctly. "I design patterns," she said. "A pattern is a set of relationships between measurements. If one measurement is wrong, the whole pattern fails. What I found in these documents is a pattern in which the same relationship between a death, a claim, and an acquisition repeats itself across 11 properties over 3 years." She paused. "I don't need to be an accountant to recognize that a pattern which repeats itself 11 times in exactly the same way is not a coincidence." The room was very still. Whitfield had no follow-up. Commissioner Briggs called a recess. He came back 40 minutes later. Rose had sat in the corridor with Mabel and Caleb during those 40 minutes, and had not said much, and none of them had eaten the sandwiches that Mrs. Alderman had thought to bring. And Cora Barker had walked her son up and down the corridor twice to keep him occupied. And Martin Henderson had sat by the wall with his folder on his lap and his eyes closed, which was either prayer or something very close to it. When Briggs returned, he sat down and he looked at the room. He looked at Crowley. He looked at the sisters. He said, "In light of the documentation presented today, I am ruling that the debt claim against the Dalton estate is not substantiated by reliable evidence. The claim is dismissed." He said it plainly and without ceremony, the way honest men deliver honest verdicts. Then he said, "I am also referring the broader pattern of property acquisitions documented in today's hearing to the Territorial Court for review. Mr. Crowley, you and your counsel will receive formal notification." Whitfield was on his feet immediately. Crowley put a hand on his arm. He stopped. Crowley stood up. He straightened his coat. He looked at the commissioner with the particular expression of a man who has just lost a round and is already calculating the next one. And then he looked at Rose. "Well done," he said, quietly. Not for the room, for her. It was the most chilling thing he had said all morning, and Rose recognized it immediately for what it was. Not a concession, but a reset. A man who had played this game long enough to know when a position was untenable and when to withdraw to stronger ground. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," Rose said, "but this part is." He walked out. His lawyers followed. The room exhaled. Cora Barker sat down in her chair and put her face in her hands, and her son put both arms around her neck with the uncomplicated tenderness of a child who didn't understand exactly what had happened, but understood that his mother was crying, and that this was a different kind of crying than the kind she usually did. Martin Henderson shook Hargrove's hand without speaking, and then sat back down and put his folder on the floor, because he didn't need to hold it anymore. Rose sat very still. She was aware of Caleb standing beside her, close but not touching, present in the way he had been present through the entire preceding weeks. Not leading, not directing, not stepping in front of anything that was hers to carry. Just there. Mabel sat on Rose's other side and didn't say anything. Then she said, "Papa would have liked this." Rose looked at her. Mabel had her notebook open on her lap, but she wasn't looking at it. She was looking at the front of the room, where Hargrove was gathering documents, with the calm efficiency of a man who had just done good work and was ready to move to the next thing. "Yes," Rose said. "He would have. He would have made a terrible fuss over it in private and been very quiet about it in public," Mabel said. "And then he would have gone out to the barn and fixed something that didn't need fixing because he didn't know what else to do with himself." Rose laughed. It came out before she could manage it. A real laugh, short and sudden, the kind that happens when feeling finally finds a direction. She pressed her fingers against her mouth. Mabel was smiling. Caleb, on Rose's other side, said nothing, but she felt the shift in him, the slight relaxation of a man who has been holding himself carefully for a long time, and has just been given reason to ease. They walked out of the county hall into the August afternoon. The street outside was ordinary. Horses at rails. A wagon crossing the far end of the road. The sounds of a town conducting its business without reference to what had just happened inside one of its buildings, because that was the nature of towns. Cora Barker caught Rose's hand as they came through the door. "Thank you," she said. "Your husband paid his debts," Rose said. "Your wife kept your records," she said to Henderson, who was a step behind. "We didn't do anything except make what was already true visible." Henderson looked at her. "Sometimes that's everything," he said. He walked to his wagon. Rose stood in the street. Caleb was beside her. He said, "Can I buy you and Mabel supper? There's a decent place on the east side of town." Rose thought about it for a moment. "Yes," she said. Mabel was already looking at Caleb with an expression that Rose recognized as the one Mabel used when she had already drawn her conclusions and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. "The East Side place has good pie," Mabel said. "I've heard." "It does," Caleb confirmed. They walked. Over supper, with the long August evening coming through the windows, something shifted between Rose and Caleb in the quiet, unhurried way that things shift when people have been through something real together and the pressure has released, and what remains is simply themselves. He asked about her father. She asked about his. He had died 6 years ago, his mother a year before that, and he had run the ranch alone since then, which Rose understood was a particular kind of loneliness that didn't require naming to be fully recognized. Mabel ate her pie and said very little, and watched everything with the patient, perceptive attention of someone who was filing it all carefully away. When they walked outside afterward, Caleb said, "I told you I wanted to discuss something that wasn't about the ranch accounts." Rose looked at him. "I remember," she said. "The hearing's over," he said. "It is." He held her gaze with the same directness he brought to everything. No hesitation, no performance, just the plain fact of what he meant. "May I court you?" he said. The street was quiet around them. Rose looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the sun-tanned face and the weathered hands and the brown hat and the man behind all of it, the one who had walked into Whitmore Dry Goods and looked at her sister's carefully repaired dress and said better than the tailor in Cheyenne without any theater about it. The one who had handed her a lawyer's address on the back of an invoice and not added a word of advice. The one who had driven her to Laramie and stayed with the horses. "I was beginning to wonder," she said, "how long a man who can face stampeding cattle would remain frightened of asking one woman a simple question." Caleb Mercer, who had worked cattle for 20 years and negotiated with suppliers and managed a ranch operation through drought and bad markets and 3 brutal Wyoming winters, looked at her. He had absolutely nothing to say. Mabel, one step behind them, made a sound that might have been a cough. It wasn't a cough. Rose smiled. It was the first time she had smiled without managing it in longer than she could remember. Spontaneous and unguarded. The smile of a woman who was still standing after everything that had tried to sit her down, and who had just realized that the ground beneath her felt, for the first time in years, like something she could trust. Somewhere in a house on the better side of Willow Creek, Beatrice Langford sat alone that evening and thought about a room full of people and a verdict that had not gone the way it was supposed to go, and about a woman in a dark blue dress she had made herself, and about the question a stranger had asked her in a dry goods store 3 weeks ago. Which side of that room do you want people to remember you standing on? She didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time, she was sitting with the question instead of ignoring it. And that, as the August dark settled over Willow Creek, Wyoming, was its own small beginning. The morning after the hearing, Rose slept until 7 o'clock. She hadn't slept past 5:30 in 4 years. She woke disoriented, reached automatically for the worry she kept on the nightstand, the way other people kept a water glass, and found it lighter than it had been in longer than she could honestly remember. Not gone. She was not naive enough to think Silas Crowley's final look across that courtroom had meant anything other than what he'd said. This isn't finished. But the immediate weight, the one that had pressed against her sternum every morning when she opened her eyes and remembered the notice face down on the kitchen table, was different now. Changed in character. Still present, but no longer crushing. She got up and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and let herself do something she almost never permitted herself. She looked at what they had, not what they lacked, not what was still uncertain, not what Crowley might do next, or what the territorial court review would mean, or how long the other family's cases would take to resolve. Just what they had, on this particular morning, in this particular house. Their father's house. Still standing. Still theirs. Mabel's voice came from the back room. She was already at her work table, which surprised no one, because Mabel's response to the release of pressure was always to work, the same way other people responded to relief by sleeping or weeping or going very quiet. The sound of her moving through her morning routine, the particular rhythm of it, was so familiar to Rose that she felt it in her chest before she consciously registered hearing it. She poured 2 cups of coffee. She carried one to the back room. Mabel was at her table with 3 pattern pieces laid out and a length of dark green wool that one of Mrs. Alderman's friends had dropped at the house 2 days ago with a request for a traveling coat. She had her pencil behind her ear and her measuring tape draped around her neck, and she looked entirely at home in herself, in the way she only ever looked when she was working. She took the coffee without looking up. "You slept," she said. "Until 7, Rose said. Mabel looked up then. 7, she repeated, as if confirming a remarkable meteorological event. "Don't make something of it," Rose said. Mabel smiled into her cup. Rose leaned against the doorframe and looked at her sister. The dark circles that were finally beginning to fade. The ink stain still on her right index finger from 3 nights ago. The complete and unself-conscious absorption in the work in front of her. Mabel at her best. Mabel as she actually was when the world gave her enough room to be it. "We need to talk about the business," Rose said. Mabel set down her pencil. "I know," she said. "The orders from last week. 11 confirmed," Mabel said. 3 more that I think will come through once Mrs. Alderman wears the riding jacket in public, which she will. She told me she was planning to wear it to the Henderson barn dance next month. 11 orders, Rose said. "More than I can fill alone," Mabel said. "Not by a great deal, but enough that I've been thinking about it." "So have I," Rose said. She pulled the small chair from the corner and sat down. They talked for 2 hours, not the way they had talked through every crisis of the past 3 years. Urgently, in low voices, counting what they had against what they needed, but differently. With the particular quality of conversation that happens when 2 people who know each other completely are planning something instead of surviving something. Rose had the ledger. Mabel had her order book. Between them, in the space above the table where the morning light came through the single window, they built the first shape of what they were going to do. The front room of the house was large enough. It had good light from the east window, which was what you needed for detailed work, and it opened directly to the porch, which meant customers could arrive without coming through the private part of the house. The work table Mabel used was too small. They would need a larger one, and a second cutting surface. And if they were going to take on a third seamstress, a third workstation against the far wall. "A third seamstress," Rose said. "Cora Barker," Mabel said simply. Rose looked at her. "She sewed her husband's work shirts herself," Mabel said. "I saw the stitching when we were at her house. She has skill, and she needs income, and she already knows us. She's not a stranger we'd have to assess." Mabel picked up her pencil. "And Mrs. Alderman mentioned that the widow Prentice, not Harold, his sister-in-law, she's been in Willow Creek for 6 months. She used to work for a dressmaker in Denver." "You've been thinking about this for a while," Rose said. "Since the night before the hearing," Mabel said. "I needed something to think about that wasn't the hearing." Rose laughed. Then she opened the ledger to a blank page and wrote across the top, in her careful accountant's hand, "Dalton Sisters, dressmaking and repairs." She looked at it for a moment. "That's what it's going to be," she said. Mabel looked at it too. "Yes," she said. She reached out and touched the edge of the page with 2 fingers. Lightly, the way you touch something you want to make certain is real. They told Caleb at the end of the week. He came for his usual account review on Friday morning, and Rose presented the business plan the way she presented everything. Organized, specific, with numbers she had verified, and projections she had been conservative about, and 3 contingency scenarios mapped for the first 6 months. Caleb read through it. He took longer than usual. Rose watched him and could not entirely read his expression, which was unusual. She had developed a fairly reliable ability to interpret the small shifts in his face over the preceding weeks. He was a man whose face didn't move much, but it wasn't still, and the difference between those 2 things had taken her a while to learn. He put the papers down. "This is good," he said. "I know," Rose said. The corner of his mouth moved. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Your continued custom," Rose said. "At the same rates, paid on the same terms." "Done," he said immediately. "And your silence about the business plan specifically until we're ready to announce it," Rose said. "I don't want Crowley hearing about a new revenue source before we've had time to establish it." Caleb nodded. "Also done. And—" Rose paused. She had thought about how to say the next part for 2 days. "I want you to understand that the business is separate from any other arrangement between us. Whatever develops between us, if anything develops between us, I need to be certain that Mercer Ridge is a customer and not a benefactor, that we earn every invoice." Caleb looked at her. "Rose," he said, "I mean it." "I know you mean it," he said. "That's why I'm not arguing about it." He picked up his coffee cup. "I wouldn't have it any other way. And if you ever thought I would, you've been paying less attention than I've come to expect from you." She looked at him. He met her gaze with the steady, unhurried directness she had come to understand was simply the way he saw everything, straight on, without deflection. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. They went back to the accounts. The first month was hard, in the way that all genuine beginnings are hard. Not discouraging, but requiring. They converted the front room over the course of a single long weekend. Rose and Mabel and Cora Barker, who had arrived on Saturday morning with her youngest balanced on her hip, and an expression of determined capability that reminded Rose, with a sudden sharp clarity, of herself on the morning she had walked into Whitmore Dry Goods with $1.17 and her back straight. They moved furniture. They hung shelving. Rose built a narrow display surface along the east wall using lumber she had bartered for by keeping accounts for the hardware store owner for 1 month, a trade she had proposed directly and he had accepted without the delay she'd expected, which told her something useful about how the town's opinion of the Dalton sisters had shifted since the hearing. Mabel's first completed order for a paying customer was Mrs. Alderman's riding jacket. She finished it on a Wednesday evening and held it up in the lamplight for a long moment before she wrapped it, and Rose, watching from the doorway, saw the expression on her sister's face and did not say anything because some things were not improved by being spoken about. Mrs. Alderman collected it Thursday morning. She put it on in the front room in front of the mirror Rose had mounted on the east wall for exactly this purpose. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Miss Dalton, I have been wearing riding jackets for 30 years. "Yes, ma'am," Mabel said. "This is the first one that has ever fit me correctly." Mabel looked at her. "The cut accounts for how a person actually sits a horse," Mabel said. "Most patterns are designed for standing. But you're not standing when you're riding." Mrs. Alderman turned to Rose. "She's remarkable," she said. "I know," Rose said. "I'm going to tell every woman I know." "We appreciate that," Rose said. Mrs. Alderman wore the jacket to the Henderson barn dance 3 weeks later, and by the following Monday, there were 7 new inquiries at the front room door. Crowley's threatened second move came in September. It was not as dramatic as Rose had anticipated, which was in some ways more unsettling than drama would have been. A letter arrived from his lawyers, challenging a procedural element of the hearing documentation. Not the substance of the verdict, but a technical argument about the admissibility of Prentice's copies as opposed to originals. Hargrove reviewed it and wrote back in terms that Rose, reading the correspondence, found deeply satisfying in their precision. The challenge went nowhere. Then, in October, 2 of Crowley's associates began spreading a revised version of the earlier rumors. Not about Rose's honesty this time, but about the business. That the quality was inconsistent. That one of the orders had been delivered late. That a customer had been dissatisfied. None of it was true. Rose handled it the way she handled most things, by doing the work so well that the rumors couldn't find purchase. When a woman came in having heard the story about inconsistent quality and asked about it directly, Rose showed her 3 completed garments and the order log with every delivery date confirmed and said, "Judge what you can see." The woman placed an order for 2 dresses before she left. Mabel never mentioned the rumors to Rose, but Rose found her, one evening in late October, sitting at her work table after the others had gone home, with her pattern pieces organized and her work lamp burning and her notebook open. Not working, just sitting. Staring at the table surface, with the expression of someone running through a calculation that didn't have a clean answer. Rose came in and sat down. She didn't ask. After a while, Mabel said, "Do you ever get tired of people trying to make us small?" "Every single day," Rose said. "And you just keep going." "What's the alternative?" Mabel was quiet. "I know," she said. "I know that. It's just—" She stopped. "Sometimes I want to have one day where nobody is trying to take something from us, where we just work, and it's just work, no threat underneath it." "That day is coming," Rose said. "You believe that?" Rose thought about it honestly, the way she always tried to think about difficult things. "I believe we are building toward it," she said. "And I believe the building is real, and I think that has to be enough for right now." She paused. "But I also think you are allowed to be tired of it. You don't have to perform resilience for me." Mabel looked at her. Then she leaned her head against Rose's shoulder, the way she had when she was 6 years old, and had fallen off the porch steps and scraped both her palms and couldn't decide whether to cry. Rose put her arm around her. They sat like that for a few minutes. Then Mabel said, "I think Mrs. Calhoun's wedding dress order is going to be the best thing I've ever made." "Tell me about it," Rose said. And Mabel straightened up and picked up her notebook and began talking, her voice moving from tired to alive in the way it always did when she was talking about something she was building. And Rose listened, and the lamp burned between them, and outside the Wyoming night was cold and clear and enormous. Beatrice Langford came to the shop in November. Rose saw her from the work table through the open door to the front room. Beatrice standing on the porch in her good coat, looking at the painted sign above the door. Dalton Sisters, Dressmaking and Repairs. Looking at it the way people look at things they've been working up to for some time. She came in. The front room had 3 women in it. Cora Barker at the cutting table, the widow Prentice finishing a hem in the corner, and Mabel discussing fabric samples with a rancher's wife from the east side. A working room. A real business. Beatrice stood just inside the door. Mabel finished her conversation and turned. She looked at Beatrice without any particular expression. Not cold, not warm. waiting. The rancher's wife excused herself and stepped out. The room went quiet in the specific way of a room where everyone is pretending not to pay close attention. Beatrice said, "I owe you an apology." Mabel looked at her. "I've been thinking about what to say for 2 months," Beatrice said. "And I've decided that there isn't a way to say it that makes it sufficient. So I'm just going to say it plainly." She paused. "What I did to you in that store was cruel. It wasn't thoughtless. I knew exactly what I was doing. I chose to do it because it made me feel important, and that is—" Her voice shifted slightly. "That is not a reason I'm proud of." Mabel was quiet. "I also repeated things about you during the hearing preparation that I knew might not be true because Crowley made it seem like the easiest thing to do," Beatrice said. "And I came very close to being the kind of person who helps a man like that destroy 2 women who did nothing to deserve it." She stopped. "You asked me which side of that room I wanted to be remembered on. I've been sitting with that question ever since." "I know," Mabel said. Beatrice looked at her. "You knew I'd come?" she said. "I hoped you would," Mabel said. "I thought you probably would. People who ask themselves hard questions usually do something about them eventually." A pause. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Beatrice said. "I wouldn't, in your position." Mabel looked at her for a long moment. "Being sorry doesn't erase what you did," she said. "That's true, and I think you know it. But it does decide what kind of person you become after doing it." She held Beatrice's gaze steadily. "So, what kind of person are you going to become?" The question sat in the room. Beatrice didn't answer immediately. She didn't reach for a quick response, which Rose, watching from the doorway, found she respected more than she expected to. "I don't entirely know yet," Beatrice said, "but I'm working on it." Mabel nodded. "Then come back when you have a clothing order," she said. "We do good work. You already know that." Something shifted in Beatrice's face. Not absolution, not the relief of having been let entirely off the hook, but something more useful than either of those. The recognition of being taken seriously, of being held to a standard instead of being either condemned or excused. She left. Cora Barker, at the cutting table, went back to her work without comment. The widow apprentice continued her hem. Mabel picked up the fabric samples she had set down. Life continued. That was, Rose thought, watching from the doorway, the most remarkable thing about all of it. That life continued. That the shop was full of work, and the work was real, and the women doing it were women who had been through hard things, and had not allowed those hard things to become the whole of their story. She went back to the accounts. The business grew, not explosively. Rose would not have trusted explosive growth, would have found it suspicious in the way she found anything that moved too fast for careful examination. It grew the way sound enterprises grow, steadily, by reputation, through the specific word of mouth that comes when the work is genuinely good and the people doing it can be trusted. By December, they had filled 31 orders. By February, they had a waiting list for the first time, which Mabel managed with the same organized precision she brought to everything and which Rose recorded in the ledger with the satisfaction of someone who has seen a number go from deficit to surplus and knows exactly what it cost to get there. Cora Barker's income from the shop was enough by March to reduce the mortgage pressure on her farm to manageable. She told Rose this on a Tuesday morning while she was cutting pattern pieces for a spring coat order, in the same direct, matter-of-fact tone that Rose had recognized on the first day and immediately liked. "It's not finished," Cora said. "But it's different. It's manageable different instead of impossible different." "That's real," Rose said. "Yes," Cora said. "It is." The Territorial Court's review of Crowley's property acquisitions concluded in March. Hargrove sent word. 3 of the 11 properties were being returned to their original owners or their estates. The others were under continued review. Crowley had retained additional legal representation and was contesting, which Hargrove had expected and for which he had prepared, and the process would take another year at minimum, which was how these things went when a wealthy man had resources and the willingness to use them. But the acquisitions had stopped, and that, Hargrove said in his letter, was the most important immediate outcome. A system that had been operating in the dark, protected by the assumption that its targets could not or would not resist, had been exposed. The people it had been built to exploit now knew it existed. And knowledge, in Rose's experience, was the thing that changed the terms of every engagement. Rose wrote back thanking him. She put the letter in the cedar chest in the back room, the same chest that held their father's original papers, the payment records, the document case from Prentice. She did not throw any of it away. You kept the evidence of what had been done and what had been survived, because memory without record was just feeling, and feeling without foundation was the thing powerful men counted on. Spring came. The shop had genuine curtains now, sewn by Mabel in the first week of business as what she called a proof of principle. If we're going to make curtains for other people's houses, our own ought to be worth looking at. They were dark blue, the same shade as the dress Mabel had worn into Whitmore Dry Goods, and they hung in the front room windows and moved in the breeze that came through when the door was open. And Rose looked at them sometimes when she was working through the accounts, and felt something that she had not felt in so long she'd had to remember what to call it. Peace, not the absence of difficulty. The presence of something solid enough to stand on while difficulty continued. Caleb came on Fridays for the account review, which had expanded from ranch accounts to a broader business consultation that neither of them had formally named, but which had evolved naturally over the months. The way most genuine things between them had evolved. Without announcement, by simple accumulation of mornings and conversations, and the particular ease of two people who had stopped performing around each other entirely. He brought the ranch accounts. Rose brought the shop accounts. They sat at the kitchen table. The Dalton kitchen table. The one their father had bought at an auction 30 years ago, and which was slightly uneven on the left front leg, and which Rose had shimmed with a folded piece of leather that had been there so long she'd stopped noticing it. They worked through the numbers. They talked about the ranch, about the business, about the territorial court's progress, about the valley, about the spring calving that had gone better than Caleb had expected, and the hay supply that hadn't. They talked the way people talk when they have learned that the other person is worth talking to and have stopped rationing themselves accordingly. One Friday in April, after they had finished the accounts and the coffee was cold and the evening was coming in through the kitchen window, Caleb said, "I spoke to Reverend Marsh." Rose looked at him. "About?" she said, though she knew. "About the earliest date he could perform a ceremony," Caleb said. "He said June is available. He also said July, if June is too soon." Rose looked at him for a long moment. "It isn't too soon," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "June," he said. "June," she agreed. She told Mabel that evening. Mabel was at her work table. She was always at her work table. And she looked up when Rose came in, and something in Rose's expression apparently communicated everything necessary, because Mabel set down her pencil and said, "June? How did you—" "Rose," Mabel said. "I've been watching the two of you at this kitchen table for 6 months. I had June in my mind before Christmas." Rose looked at her sister. "You're insufferable," she said. "I know," Mabel said. She picked up her pencil. "I'm also going to make you the most beautiful dress this territory has ever seen. And I don't want any arguments about the cost of the fabric, because I've already set aside what I need and it's done." Rose opened her mouth. "No arguments," Mabel said, without looking up. Rose closed it. She sat down in the corner chair and watched her sister work and did not argue. The ceremony was small. Caleb had said he didn't need a large wedding, and Rose had believed him because it was consistent with everything she knew about how he moved through the world, and she had not wanted a large wedding either, partly because she was not a woman who had ever cultivated an appetite for performance, and partly because the only people she cared about having present were the people who had actually been present, for all of it. The accounts and the hearings and the cold mornings and the document case and the letter under the door and the thread they had bought with their own money on the day it all began. Mabel stood beside her. Caleb stood beside Fletcher, who shook Rose's hand after the ceremony with the particular warmth of a taciturn man expressing something he didn't have many words for. Cora Barker came with her children. Mrs. Alderman came with her husband. Martin Henderson came with a jar of preserves. His wife had made the autumn before she died, which he had been keeping for a significant occasion, and which he handed to Rose without explanation. and which she accepted with the same absence of explanation, because some things communicated themselves completely without words. Harold Prentice came. He stood at the edge of things, as he generally did, but he was there, and he shook Caleb's hand and told Rose quietly that he was glad it had come out the way it had. She told him she was glad he had kept the copies. He said he was glad someone had finally asked. The dress Mabel made was indeed the most beautiful thing in the room. It was ivory white, simply cut, with a high collar and sleeves that fell exactly as they should, and a line at the waist that Mabel had spent 3 evenings getting precisely right. No ornamentation except for a narrow band of pale blue at the cuffs, the same shade as the patched dress still folded in the cedar chest at home. Rose had wanted that detail specifically. She had asked Mabel for it. She had not explained why, and Mabel had not asked, because Mabel already knew. The marriage did not change the shop. That had been clear from the beginning. Rose had stated it, and Caleb had accepted it, and it was never revisited. Because it was not a point of negotiation, but a simple fact. The way most things Rose considered non-negotiable were simple facts. She continued working alongside Mabel every day. She continued managing the accounts, the customers, the suppliers, the difficult conversations that arose when orders were complex or timelines were tight. Mercer Ridge remained a customer on the same terms as every other customer. Invoices paid within the agreed period, no deference, no exceptions. Caleb understood this. He had understood it before she told him, and she had told him anyway, because she was a woman who said the important things directly, rather than assuming they had been received. And he had nodded, and he wouldn't have it any other way, and she had believed him, and she had been right to believe him, which she noted in her own private ledger of things she had assessed correctly. She moved some of her things to Mercer Ridge. Some of her things stayed at the house. The shop stayed at the house. Mabel stayed at the house. The arrangement was practical and entirely satisfactory to everyone involved, which is the best possible description of an arrangement between people who have been honest with each other from the beginning. 1 year after the morning, they had walked into Whitmore Dry Goods with $1.17 and their chins up. Rose and Mabel returned. This time they were purchasing fabric wholesale, not thread, not 2 spools at a cost carefully calculated against the remaining coins in a purse. Bolts of wool and cotton and fine linen, ordered by the yard in quantities that required Aldous Webb to bring his inventory ledger to the counter and write down what they needed because there was too much to remember. Webb treated them the way he should have treated them the first time, with the simple professionalism of a merchant conducting business with customers who had every right to be there. Rose accepted this without comment. It was not forgiveness. It was not the restoration of something that had been taken from them. It was simply the present, which was different from the past, and which they had made different through the particular combination of work and refusal and stubbornness and intelligence, and a former bookkeeper's document case, and a cowboy who had looked at a patched dress and seen exactly what it was. Mabel kept that patched dress. It was in the cedar chest in the back room of the house, folded under the document case and their father's papers and the letter from Hargrove about the territorial court's findings. Every patch was still where she had stitched it. The mismatched thread on the shoulder seam. The curved repair at the hip that had taken her most of an evening. The 4 hidden reinforcements Rose had added when Mabel wasn't looking. She would not throw it away. Not because she was ashamed of it, because she was not. It was evidence, not of poverty, of survival, not of what they had lacked, but of what they had done with what they had. Every stitch in that dress was a decision made under pressure and made well, and Mabel understood, in the way she understood all things that were made from careful work, that the value of a thing was not determined by the material it was made from, but by what it cost to make it and what it was worth when it was done. The shop employed 4 women by the following spring, 5 by summer. They were women who needed income and had skills that the world had not yet found a way to recognize, and Mabel found those skills with the same unhurried attention she brought to everything. A widow whose embroidery was better than anything available in the 3 nearest towns. A young woman whose father had refused to allow her to apprentice with a tailor in Cheyenne because she was a daughter and not a son. A former schoolteacher whose hands had been too arthritic to continue writing on a chalkboard, but who could still cut a pattern with extraordinary precision. Rose managed all of it. She managed it the way she managed everything. Without excess, without drama, with the cold, practical love of a woman who understood that competence is one of the most profound forms of care. One afternoon in the second autumn of the business, a young woman came to the shop door. Rose was at the front counter when she heard the knock. Tentative, the knock of someone who is not entirely certain they have the right to knock. She opened the door. The young woman was perhaps 20, wearing a dress that had been repaired multiple times with careful but inexperienced hands. The patches were visible. The color was faded. Her posture was what Rose recognized immediately and specifically, because she had seen it on her sister outside Whitmore Dry Goods on a July morning that felt, now, like it had happened to someone else, or to a version of herself she had long since outgrown. The lowered head, the folded shoulders, the readiness to disappear before someone decided she didn't belong. "I'm sorry to bother you," the young woman said. "I heard you might take on work, sewing work. I'm not trained, but She stopped. "I can't pay for lessons. I thought maybe I could work in exchange for learning. I don't know if that's something you'd consider. I can leave if it isn't." Rose looked at her. She looked at the dress, the repairs, the patches. She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. The young woman came in. Mabel was at the big work table in the center of the room, cutting pieces for a winter coat order, and she looked up when they entered and took in the situation with the swift, complete understanding that was her particular gift. She set down her scissors. She walked across the room. She stopped in front of the young woman and looked, not at her dress in the way that catalogued its poverty, but at her dress in the way of someone reading work. The decisions made under constraint. The evidence of hands that had tried to do a thing well without the tools to do it perfectly. She looked at one repair in particular. A small seam on the collar, resewn with tiny, even stitches that someone had clearly struggled to make neat and largely succeeded. "You did this yourself?" Mabel said. The young woman nodded. "That's good work," Mabel said. She said it the way someone says something true, plainly, without extra warmth, the way you state a fact about something you know. "Better than the tailor in Cheyenne. That's very good work." The young woman looked up. And in the precise way that a window lets in light it previously blocked, something opened in her face. Rose watched it happen. She had seen it before, once, on a July morning in a dry goods store, on the face of a woman who had lowered her head so many times she had almost forgotten she could raise it. She had seen it, and she had never stopped seeing it, and she would carry it with her for the rest of her life, that moment. The one where a person discovers that what they have built in the dark has value in the light. "Sit down," Mabel said. "I'll show you how the pattern works." The young woman sat. Outside, through the front room window, Caleb Mercer passed on his way to the livery, and he touched the brim of his hat toward the window without slowing. A small gesture, the kind a man makes when the person inside is busy with something important and doesn't need to be interrupted but deserves to be seen. Rose saw it. She turned back to the accounts, and somewhere in the back of her mind, with the quiet permanence of something that has been learned at genuine cost and therefore never leaves, she held what Willow Creek had spent years trying to teach her, and what had turned out, upon examination, to be exactly wrong. That a woman was worth the quality of her clothing, that poverty was a character judgment, that the size of your purse determined the size of your dignity. She had paid the tuition for that lesson in full, and what she had learned was its opposite, stated plain, stated final, the way she stated everything that mattered. A worn dress could tell you how hard a woman had fought to survive. It could never tell you, not once, not ever, what that woman was capable of when someone finally gave her the room to show it.